Hi, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
And welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics, where we look at various books on theology and philosophy and even science and talk through them. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on how to be an atheist, right?
Yeah.
By Mitch Stokes. And we have worked our way to Chapter 5 in this book, and Stokes is helping us to understand what science, basically, this book is broken down in two sections, science and then on ethics. And so we're working our way through the science portion. And his thesis is that he doesn't think that atheists are skeptical enough, or at least consistently skeptical.
Right. Consistent is the big key there.
With regard to their ideas. Right.
Yeah, we don't want to be too skeptical where we're not allowing anything to come to the forefront of knowledge, because then we just get an impasse. But we also don't want to believe everything, because then a lot of the bad stuff gets in. So he asked for a sober skeptic. So,
that's right. Sober skepticism.
Yeah. Check and verify.
So in Chapter 5 here, this is entitled Photoshopped Science. And the basic idea here is he's going to tell us about two events in the history of science, beginning with Hume and then later in the 20th century with the logical positivists. And he's going to suggest that they perceive science as too pristine, too pure, too sterile, right? He's going to say photoshopped. and then in the next chapter, he's going to show why it's a little messier than what they thought it was.
Yeah.
And so that's where he's headed to in this particular chapter. So the first thing that he does is we're back to our good friend David Hume again.
Yes, of course.
And he says, remember that according to Hume, all knowledge is grounded in sense perception. In other words, Hume was what we call an empiricist. He believed that knowledge came from our senses, our seeing and hearing and touching and all that kind of stuff. That was the basis of knowledge. But he makes a distinction that Hume does, that there was really kind of two kinds or types of source of knowledge here. He says, according to Hume, matters of fact must be grounded in sense experience. So that's one kind of knowledge, matters of fact, right? That is any contingent truth about the world, anything that's not simply true by definition or otherwise necessary. So for instance, there's grass outside, right? It's a matter of fact. It's something true about the world, but it's contingent. It doesn't necessarily have to be true. You could have just, the house could have just been built, and so there's no dirt because it hasn't been planted yet, and there's no grass because it hasn't been planted yet, and so there's just dirt outside, right? So a matter of fact is something that is that we verify empirically. It's a fact about the world, right? On the other side, Hume says that there is another kind of knowledge that he calls relation of ideas, right? And so the idea here is that these are things that we can know without appealing to our sense experience, right? We know these by definition, right? So red objects are colored objects, or 2 + 2 is 4. Those types of things are relation of ideas, right? We don't have to go out and double check to make sure that 2 + 2 is 4 by going out in the world and saying, okay, let's start counting and double check
and making sure that every time 2 and add 2 is 4. These are kind of the a priori things, like there's no such thing as a married bachelor.
That's right.
Or
all bachelors are unmarried men.
Yeah,
or something
there you go.
like that. Yeah. So he says this distinction then between matters of facts and relation of ideas is what's come to be called Hume's fork. Right?
So it takes either one of two paths. Either it's a sense perception or it's a relational of ideas.
Right.
So
right.
if it doesn't fit in those, you're off the fork, and you're not being devoured.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. You're not being devoured by knowledge.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right. In other words, if it doesn't fit in those, you should forget about it and move on. Right. And we'll see a quote from Hume that rather eloquently puts that together for us. Right. All right, and so what part of what Hume was doing then was this what he calls this doodling with words is what Hume was trying to get after, right? That he didn't want us to be able to do that. It's a criteria not merely for what we can know, but also for separating sense from nonsense. Right? In other words, if anything wasn't these types of knowledge, empirical matters of fact, or we might say mathematical or something like that, logical, definitional relation of ideas, then it wasn't worth pursuing, right? It wasn't worth pursuing. According to Hume, all matters of facts ultimately connect with the world to be meaningful, and relation of ideas need not submit to the test of connecting with the world, but that's only because they're meaningful by definition. So notice now we've thrown in this idea of meaningfulness. So what we're going to see in the 20th century is this is going to become big, right? Because the logical positivists are going to jump on this and say there are certain things that are statements that are meaningful and those that are not meaningful, right? And Hume kind of blazes the trail here with this distinction between matters of fact and relation of ideas. And so he says philosophers are often ridiculed for doodling with words, and rightly so. They're prone to analyze language in excruciating detail, getting bogged down in pedantic quagmires.
Yeah.
And so those are our two paths, and there is no medium. There is nothing in between.
There's just either empirical science, which is the matter of facts, or it's the realm of mathematics relationship to ideas.
That gives us knowledge. That's the source of our knowledge, right? And so Hume then can, he suggests, use this as a weapon for helping us to get. In fact, here's a famous quote from the book by Hume on an inquiry concerning human understanding. This is what Hume tells us with regard to these two areas. He says, when we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
Yeah. Yeah, we only have a little amount of time. We should be concerned with just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah.
A Joe Friday.
Yeah, that's right.
And anything else is just, well, how many angels can dance on the head of the pin? Okay, you can have your fun outside of this, but we're doing science here.
That's right. Serious business is what we're after. So just the facts, man.
We're cold, logical, lethargic people who are in our lab coats, and all we're doing is test, experiment, recheck, publishing. We just want to keep it to those two areas because anything else doesn't really get you anything. What's the nature of the soul? Does
God exist?
Does God exist? Is he the big mover of all things? We don't care about any of that.
It's not a matter of fact that we can verify empirically, nor is it true by definition. Committed to the flame.
Right. Yeah. So nice.
Yeah. Thank you, Hume. So Hume had an agenda, and he says, of course, don't we all, right? Part of this agenda was to remove metaphysics and theology from the list of acceptable academic practices.
Yeah, he wants to get rid of philosophy almost altogether.
Yeah.
Because they really haven't done much for him in the way until Newton comes along. He's a big fan of Newton. Newton not only gives him kind of the science of it, so the abstract reasoning, or the experimental reasoning, but then he also gives them the science, so creating essentially calculus.
Yeah.
Just because he needed to.
Yeah, that's right. I need calculus to help me explain gravity.
Yeah,
so
just this one problem.
Yeah.
Recreate calculus. Yeah. And so there's the relational
the relation
of ideas. Yeah. So he's really trying to harp back on this Newtonian revolution of
so what
science.
Notice what he's trying to do is he's saying Newton and company have given us a model of how we can gain knowledge, and so he wants to take that model now and apply it in philosophy and that sort of thing. He doesn't necessarily throw out philosophy, but metaphysics and that kind of stuff he's going to suggest.
It doesn't really get you much. You can't experiment with where's the soul, what's the nature of the little gremlins that move the gears in the clock. None of that really gets you anywhere. So we should just throw it out. And again, this Photoshopness of having it be a cold calculating perfect system where you plug in your numbers, you plug in your observations, and out comes either a 1 or a 0. So that's what Stokes is trying to get to with this title of Photoshop science, of saying, it's just this perfect system, and Hume is trying to refine it down to these two systems that get you information, and these are the only ways that they do it.
Right. Yeah. Good. So this received tradition, he says, basically from Hume, is that of a cold, sterile, steely science, and of course, the story of this tradition is really the story of the 20th century. And so now what he does here is he moves from Hume and he moves to the early 20th century, like in the 1920s and so forth, and to the what's been called the logical positivists or the logical empiricists, right? So these were a group of mainly German-speaking philosophers, and philosophically minded scientists, and they were then they pick up on what Hume was doing in the mid 1700s, right?
Yeah, they're kind of like his apostles. They took his work and wanted to move it further down the road of what it was initially doing. So. Hume was okay with separating the newfound science from philosophy and theology. The logical positives come in and kind of clean house and kind of have a litmus test of if you have any of these ideas of metaphysics or some type of theology, you need to be driven from the ivory tower so that we can establish establish this new order.
Because you're treading in meaningless gobbledygook, right?
Right.
So they band together, and their group, at least the most famous portion of these groups, was called the Vienna Circle, right? And and it's interesting, they do move one would suggest they move philosophy down the road a bit, right? They invent, for all practical purposes, symbolic logic, right?
Yeah,
beginning with Frege.
You learn in still today in deductive logic classes and your syllogisms and all the fun little things that you have to do. But it's helpful because it helps to clarify, or it kind of puts a mathematical spin on language and tries to show through a representational letter logic process how argumentation is occurring. And so you can kind of see where you're making your mistakes without having to kind of look at the argumentation. You're just concerned with
the
representation.
form and the structure of the argument. So you can look at the form and structure. You can outline the form and structure symbolically, right? And then that'll tell you whether or not you have we might say a valid argument, right?
Which, if you like algebra and then philosophy, that's the way to go. So I really took it to heart once I found a book that, in fact, that you had. I had thrown out the book that I was supposed to learn from, and I used your book. But that's the one that I liked, and I was like, oh, this is just algebra with philosophy. That's the pairing of two geeky things for me. That was great.
So, and so that's where the logical positivists got us, right? They got us to this symbolic logic, and they suggested that they realized that they were in a situation not unlike Hume, right? Their discontent with philosophy, Stokes tells us, was indeed a major factor in the scientific revolution that happened around that time. Now, also, there were lots of things going on. We're talking about Einstein's theory of general relativity, and all that kind of stuff was beginning to, we might say, blow up.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, almost literally.
Yeah. And quantum mechanics and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you were going from a Newtonian understanding to a little bit later than probably the 20s, 30s, but I mean, you had kind of the understanding of what an atom was, and the whole Einstein versus Bohr kind of rivalry would probably put it. It was kind of the interesting time of science, because then you had kind of the powerhouses trying to outdo each other, and you had your camps and stuff like that. And I don't think you really have that these days, but that was the boxing matches before Hitler divided the world, and we didn't hear from Germany until way later.
Until a little later, yeah. All right. But he says here, a significant part of the problem with philosophy, said the logical positivists, was that philosophers had been bewitched by language, right? That was the issue, language. And he says that he's mentioned earlier, and we're now in a place where we can see that philosophers said the logical positivists had become preoccupied with problems that weren't problems at all. They were pseudo problems, right? And so they were looking. The things that philosophers, especially metaphysicians, were involved in weren't really problems at all. They were playing games with language. And so the logical positivists wanted to move in with this clarifying, logical approach, right, to help wade through all of this playing games with language that they thought the metaphysicians were doing. In fact, he gives us what he calls one of the most notorious cases is from Heidegger's "What is Metaphysics?" And of course, we gotta at least quote a portion of this so that folks understand. This is the kind of things that the logical positivists railed against, cringed when they heard it, right? Became angry and banging their fist on the ground.
What do you mean? What are you talking about? So this is an interesting quote. It's what is to be investigated is being only and nothing else, being alone and further nothing, solely being, and beyond being nothing. What about this nothing? Does the nothing exist only because the not, i.e. the negation, exists? Or is it the other way around? Does negation and the not exist because the nothing exists? And it goes on further and says things like, indeed, the nothing itself as such was present. What about this nothing? The nothing itself, nothings.
There you go. So let's talk about nothing.
Very clear.
Yeah. And what is nothing? And what do we mean by nothing? And well, the nothing itself is nothing. All right. So now we have some knowledge.
We have something? Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because Krauss is kind of one of these people that we looked at 2 episodes ago, where he also wants to talk about nothing, but when he says nothing, he does mean something. Right. So it seems like we've gone back the other direction, where pretty soon it's going to be the Christians that are going to be burning nothing in effigy. It's right. You can read this quote and see where these people were getting frustrated at when you're having this discussion where you're having to pull in fifth negations in sentences in order to understand, when they have this structure that they're trying to implement that has, a logic, a mathematical feel to it, that they're trying to derive information. They're not trying to woo the crowd with tricks of phrases or getting lost in, where everything is at. They're putting an end to even that, and again, creating the syllogisms and stuff like that. Really trying to bring in a mathematical, logical approach that kind of slows the language portion of it and brings more of the science factor into.
Yeah, so that's really, the idea here is that philosophy was, as Mitch Stokes tells us, was trucking in meaningless language, right? The obvious cure, said the logical positivists, was to use something like Hume's fork, his criteria of meaning. They said that a statement is meaningful if it had two particular ways, similar to what Hume said, right? If number one, it can be empirically checked or verified. Can we check it? Can we check the statement against our experience, our empirical experience, right? Or verify it, and that there's an existence of it in the world. And secondly, so empirical verification or empirically checked. And secondly, it's a matter of definition or analytic, right? So these two conditions correspond to Hume's matters of fact and relation of ideas. The first condition underwrites science, empirical verification, while the second, he tells us, licenses mathematics and logic, right? That is a matter of definition or analytic. Right.
So, it's saying something that the car cannot be both on the street and in the garage would be a logical statement that gets you the non-contradiction, law of non-contradiction. But you're not playing with the words of, well, the car has this state of being where it could be in the garage, but then we know that nothing is outside the garage with the car, and so you're not getting into this kind of trope of saying a bunch of useless complication gobbledygook, is essentially what they call it, where it's just a straightforward, this is the logical law that we're applying to, or the mathematical law, or a definition of terms. So you don't have to talk about all the things that the circle isn't. You can say the circle has no sides, and continue to clarify, what the definition of a circle is. So.
Right. So these two notions then are the empirical verification and the idea of matters of definition are then what they say helps us to eliminate the meaninglessness with regard to language, especially in metaphysics and theology, by the way. So he says that then they use this as a language, as a weapon, in the same way that Hume uses his distinction as a weapon, right? The logical positivist version of Hume's fork was known as the verifiability criterion. And it became a fearful weapon wreaking havoc, as Hume might say, right, among philosophy departments throughout Europe and America. The verifiability criteria convinced a significant portion of the academic community that traditional philosophy, what the logical positivists called metaphysics, was dead, right? It was over with. It was just a game with language, and it was meaningless, and so we don't need to do that anymore. Right? We can throw that out. And, of course, theology oftentimes is part of the area of metaphysics, and so you can throw out theology and as well, because, again, are those questions issues empirically verifiable? No. Are they true by definition? No. Well, as Hume would say, commit them to the flames.
Yeah. This gets rid of the God of the gap, or anything where you're using God did it, or Satan did it, or whatever the little demons in the clock make it slow down, and that's why you have to wind it back up again. So it's removing all that and just looking for either a visual observation that can be displayed to others, and they can go out and do similar experiments or check the findings, or it's a matter of definition where you're applying key definition or logic to discovering new things through the use of that logic.
Yeah, and so he gives us an example here. He says that the logical positivists were more philosophically Spartan than even Hume, right? And so he says, take, for example, the problem of the external world. Now, most people would not see the external world as a problem, right? They would see that as the answer.
Unless you're a philosopher, then you see it as a problem,
So notice, all right, so the problem of what is that? So whereas Hume believed it to be a genuine philosophical problem, right? That is, how do we verify, or does the external world exist, and how do we come to the conclusion that it does? How do we argue for that? So whereas Hume believed is this to be a genuine problem, one that revealed real and troubling limitations on human knowledge. The logical positivist dismissed the problem of the external world, right? Is there an external world, and how do we argue for it? As a pseudo problem, right? Merely disguised as substantive philosophy. And so, after all, there's no empirical difference, and this is the key point, right? There's no empirical, that is, physically, sensory, a way to examine. There's no empirical difference between a matrix-type scenario and the ordinary world, right? So the question is, are we living in a matrix, or is this the ordinary world? Well, the logical positive says there's no empirical difference. There's no way to determine the difference. If you're in the matrix or in the ordinary world, they're both our physical, our sense perceptions are doing the same types of things, right? And so since that's the case, according to empiricism, we can't rationally choose between the two. The logical positives then said that there's no problem. In other words, both scenarios are logically equivalent. Both the matrix scenario and the ordinary physical real world are logically equivalent, and so there's no problem.
Man, where would physics be without the matrix movie? Because you can think of this as one of two ways. If you're kind of the traditional philosopher, you want to say, well, it does make a difference. Like, look at what the Matrix says is we care about being in the real world, and we care about being in this dystopian world where we're scrounging and we're eating porridge, and that's the real world, and that's what we care about, and we took the red pill. But at the same time, if you die in the Matrix, you die in the real world. It doesn't matter if the bullets are real or not. They still have the same. You having a bullet in the Matrix is just the same as having it in the real world, and it doesn't matter if it's a computer program.
So they're logically equivalent, right?
Yeah.
Death.
Yeah. So death or running into the tree, you still bump into something. When you're fighting somebody, you can fight them in the real world or in the Matrix. It doesn't matter. So if the outcome is the same, that little portion of is this reality is something that it doesn't bring you anything different.
Right. It doesn't add to anything, right?
Yeah.
And so Stokes tells us, so instead of solving this problem of the external world, the logical positivist dissolves it, is what he says, right? And of course, knowing Stokes, he has a quip about that, right? So his quip is, you'd be excused entirely if you think they merely swept it under the rug.
Yes, right.
So logical positive also convinced most of the academic philosophy that any reference to God is literal nonsense. They regulated all moral discourse as well, right? Murder is wrong, is merely expresses our emotions about we don't like murder, right? Bad murder, right? I don't like it, So religious and ethical discourse say nothing true or false about the world. And so it was meaningless. Scientific and mathematical discourse, on the other hand, are not only meaningful, but the surest way to genuine knowledge. So religious and ethical discourse are meaningless because they don't say anything true about the world. You can't verify them empirically, and they're not true by definition. And so it's just like Heidegger's expose on nothingness. They are meaninglessness with regard to what they tell us.
You can continue to talk about nothing outside of there, but we now control the hearts and minds of the future generations of scientists and philosophers.
Right.
And so the rational positives are like we could liken it to Spock, but more so because Spock had a half human side, and so there were elements where the unrational part tend to creep in.
That's right. Sneak in, pop up its head a little bit.
But it's really fun always going through old Star Trek, the best Star Trek, and picking that out and saying, well, is burning the last bit of fuel to hopefully in the hopes of alerting the Enterprise that they're adrift in space, or would it have been better to live for 3 hours longer by continuing on? Well, then you go, was that a kind of a hopeful shot of faith and, or an act of desperation, or was it the most logical thing to do?
That's right.
And so here they would say, there's no faith. There's no this was the out of all the options, this was the most logical thing to do, and it got a desired outcome. So even if God exists, whether or not God pointed the Enterprise at the exact same spot to see the trail that alerted them to the shuttlecraft being out of fuel, then it doesn't matter, because assuming God doesn't get you anywhere in that type of argument.
Yeah, right.
Although we would want to argue against that, and so there is arguments that we will get into, just not completely in this chapter.
Right, and so he says their positive or constructive project was to study the rational methods of science, right, which included logic and mathematics as tools in hopes of limiting the pursuit of truth to those methods. So if we want to get at truth, we only look at, logic and mathematics. That is, those scientific types of things that they said, right? Philosophy, according to the logical positives, was limited to these two projects and nothing else. So if you were doing philosophy according to the logical positivists, you're only doing logic, mathematics, and that sort of empirical verification, stuff like that, right? Mm-hmm. So this became known as the analytical school in philosophy. Right. And so metaphysics was kind of pushed to the side.
Yeah.
And so for a large part of the 20th century, at least the beginning of the 20th century, in philosophy departments, they kind of split. And so you could study comparative religion, but not religion as a philosophy discipline, right? And so religion and questions about the God and that sort of thing, faith, all those types of things were pushed out of the academy to a certain extent anyway. And so the only way you get it is to study comparative religion, right? but it's no philosophical.
And that's
issues.
more of a social. You're looking at people groups and their belief systems and how it impacts the world or the culture or the society. You're not really saying the religion of Thor, is bringing about a truth claim. Right. You're just saying, those who believe in Thor tend to war and rape and kill because they're going to be rewarded as warriors.
Nothing against Thor.
At the end.
Nothing against.
Well, not the new Thor, the new loving-kinding Thor. The Old Testament Thor is the mean Thor.
That's right. That's right. Not the New Testament Thor.
So great. So the logical positivists come in, they clean everything up, and we're good to go. And that's what happens to science.
Absolutely, except there were huge problems with the logical positives.
Oh man,
yeah, go figure, right?
Yeah. And it seems ironic here that we get into the 60s and 70s, the time of cultural revolution and free love
rebellion
and drug use, extensive drug use, and it all seems to fall apart.
Go figure, right? Logical positivism became harder to maintain during the 60s, 50s, and 60s. There was a problem at its core, Stokes tells us.
Sure.
And it's the verifiability criteria undermined itself.
Yeah.
Right? So undermined itself. So what does that mean? Well, here's the issue. What happens when you apply the verifiability criteria to itself?
Run Hume's fork through itself. Where does it go? It doesn't go anywhere. How can you verify it? Through your senses.
No, you can't.
Right, you can't. Or how do you...
And it's not true by definition.
Yeah, right. Develop a truth claim by logic or anything. It's not happening. And
so that means that it was meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. So we should throw it out.
Yeah.
So this is what we talk about when I think episode 15 was for us, when we talk about a worldview has to be consistent within itself. If it fails upon its own merits, for example, postmodernism, there are no absolute truths. It is an absolute truth claim. It falsifies itself.
Yeah.
So if you have a right off the bat, if you have a if it's unable to be consistent within itself, it's a sign of a failed argument and should be discarded.
Sign of a failed worldview.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah. Very good, yeah. So there were these types of issues. The requirement that a meaningful statement must be either empirically verifiable or else a matter of definition is itself neither one of these, and so the verifiability criteria doesn't meet its own requirement. It eventually, Stokes tells us, imploded. Right? It caved in on itself.
Yeah. And so the best people to realize that would be the logical positivists who are going down, and I just imagine, the kind of a renaissance, a revolution within itself to try and get who's the most logical positivist person, and someone says, I don't even do sense claims, I only do logic, and someone gets to the end and goes, no, everything is done because we can't even support our own conclusions. That's how logical positivist I am.
Right. And
he's the last one standing.
Right. And so we had guys like Quine, who was an American philosopher, and Thomas Kuhn, who was a historian of science, right, began to attack this particular approach. And Kuhn also attacked science and criticized it with regard to its social implications. And which we'll see in the next chapter here, right? The logical positivist, Stokes tells us, picture of science turned out to be heavily doctored. Their photoshopped version was pristine and perfect. In fact, it was a little too perfect, eerily smooth, and plastic-like. Up close, it didn't look human, right? and so it began to unravel, right? And he tells us that then in the next chapter, he says, I'm going to argue that when we do take time to look closely at scientific methods, those of us who pride ourselves on our no-nonsense skeptical stance will have good reason to be skeptical about important features of science, right? And about the status of current scientific theories. Now notice, he says, of course, this claim can be easily misconstrued as saying we should be skeptical of all things science, but that's not what he's saying, right? He says that's not my point, since that isn't his view. Rather, my point, he says, and he's going to talk to us about this, is that anyone who takes skepticism seriously should also be skeptical about the claim that science is somehow in conflict with God's existence, right?
Yeah. So again, especially in the next chapter, which will probably be 2 episodes within itself, because there's a lot to unpack there. But it's not the fact that he's critiquing the fact that science fails or isn't possible to do. He's undermining the fact of we have this kind of laboratory, clean room, disinfected view of science where, again, it's men in lab coats, they're standing around computers with blinking numbers or titrating their thing. And what happens from there is, okay, I observe this, my theory is X. I do experiment Y. I get result Z. Does it prove my theory? Yes, no, okay, no, then I return back and create a new theory and do all this again. And it's not that clean. It's not that
it's not that simple.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that. It's a whole lot more complicated.
Right. And in the next chapter, he does a really good job of just talking about even getting to a theory, which you think, oh, okay, well, you just come up with kind of the best explanation. He goes into good development of exactly how scientists come up with theories, stay with theories, check theories, falsify theories, and that's just the what we would consider the easy part. Then it's coming up with all the type of experimentation that you do,
coming up with the theory itself.
or how you test it, how you verify it, what you allow, what you don't allow, and so the next chapter is really good. But again, he's not critiquing that you can't do science, because even Christians who hold or deists who hold to the idea that science is the way in which God has ordered things, and so we can know that because of who God is. So not even Christians would say we don't have the ability to do science. It's just that we're grounded on the fact that the ability to do science is within the framework of a Christian worldview, at least from our standpoint.
And it's a human enterprise. And so it has all the shortcomings and problems that every human enterprise has, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so that's what we'll look at next time. So that is chapter 5, Photoshopped Science. He's going to say it was on the basis of this, pristine, pure view of what science was all about, which turns out to be not as pristine and pure as it was made out to be.
Yeah, it does well for, a couple decades there, but unfortunately, once you start questioning morality after World War II, and you have Cultural Revolution and everything like that, that kind of tends to creep into the universities and science as a whole, and we see that even today, where sometimes allowing different sciences to come into, or I guess different studies to come into and try and claim an avenue of science with gender studies and kind of the social sciences, or even having kind of different takes on science, like having a feminist theory, a Marxist view of science. So science is this understanding that class conflict occurs, and you have an understanding of looking at it through that prism, and prison too. And so we see that science isn't this detached thing. We have people at the helm who are the scientists, and they're conflicted. They're not always logical, and so having this, again, Photoshop view of science isn't at all what science is. So what does it actually look like? And that's what the next chapter is going to be.
Yeah, very good. So thank you for walking with us through this particular chapter, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.